Welcome back, everyone. You'll recall we're in chapter 23, and we're to the point now where we're going to talk about these so-called extraembryonic membranes. And these are listed then 1 through 4 on your handout, on your lecture outline, under extraembryonic membranes. And notice the number 1 is the chorion, and let's go ahead and just use page 879, figures 2310 and 2311, and then page 880, figure 23.12, to talk about the development of the placenta and to talk about the role that the chorion plays in this process. So, page 879, figure 2310 up at the top of the page. Take just a minute and locate the chorion. And notice it's labeled off to the left. Now take a minute and locate the chorionic villi. So off to the right in the area where, again, the placenta is forming at this point. Notice we have these finger-like chorionic villi in the area that's labeled developing placenta, and the villi themselves aren't labeled, but they're pretty obvious. If you look right where it says developing placenta and follow those lines on in, you're seeing the lines going to the villi. And then also keep in mind, figure 23.10, if you notice in the lower right-hand corner, there's a reminder that we're also seeing a portion of the endometrium. And so from the lower from the lower right-hand corner all the way up to the upper right-hand corner, this is all part of the endometrium. This is all a portion of that inner lining of the uterus. Sticking with figure 23.10 for a moment, take a minute and just recall now that we have blood from the mother's bloodstream. We have maternal blood coming to the placenta. And so up towards the top right, notice the labeled maternal blood vessels. And recall that the red vessels that are being shown, red, of course, indicating that they're carrying oxygenated blood, those red vessels we've referred to as maternal arterioles. And recall also then that those arterioles are carrying oxygenated blood into the area of the placenta, or into the areas actually of the placenta, into these spaces which make up part of the placenta. And you'll recall then each of these spaces that's receiving maternal blood is referred to as a lacuna. And so if we count on figure 23.10, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these lacunae being shown. And then again, keep in mind that maternal blood will flow into the lacunae, will flow across the lacunae, and wash across the membrane separating the lacunae from the villi. And then keep in mind that maternal blood will now leave as deoxygenated blood via those blue maternal blood vessels, those blue arterioles, which we call maternal arterioles. And so picture now what's happening in figure 23.10 as time goes on. We have blood carrying oxygen, that blood then part of the mother's bloodstream coming into the spaces, into the lacunae. We have that oxygenated blood washing over the surfaces, the membranes of the villi. And notice also now and recall within each villus there are very small blood vessels. And recall then what's happening is that as the maternal blood is washing over the surface of these villi, over the membrane, making up the surface of these villi, this blood then is giving up oxygen. Oxygen is simply diffusing from the mother's bloodstream and across the barrier, across the membrane, and into those blood vessels that you're seeing in the villi. And so now the vessels which you can see are labeled in red, or are shown in red actually in each villus, these have picked up oxygen from the mother's bloodstream. And of course, now that oxygenated blood is going to make its way via the merging of small blood vessels into larger and larger blood vessels. That oxygenated blood is going to make its way eventually to the umbilical cord, and through the umbilical cord and to the developing embryo. And we'll come back and pick up on that process in just a minute. Meanwhile, though, again, just so you're good, make sure now you can also picture, as time goes on in figure 23.10, as this maternal blood washes over the surface of the villi, it then, remember, leaves via the very small blue blood vessels, via the so-called maternal venules, and gets back into the mother's bloodstream. And as we've talked about then, at this point, when the two bloodstreams are very close to one another without ever mixing, the maternal blood and the embryonic blood are very, very close to one another in the area of the villi. And again, they're close enough that materials can be exchanged between the two bloodstreams without any merging of the bloodstreams themselves. And so every single mother's red blood cell remains in the mother's bloodstream. Every single embryo's red blood cell remains in the embryo's bloodstream. Let's take a look now at figure 2311 down at the bottom of page 879. Take a minute here again and orient yourself and compare 2311 with 2310 up above. And notice in 2311 then, we're seeing just a portion of the placenta, and we're seeing a single lacuna. We're seeing a single space. And notice now this lacuna is labeled for you, left-hand side, about halfway down. Follow the line into the space, into the lacuna. Again, notice then within this lacuna, we have chorionic villi. Now we're seeing more detail. We're seeing more clearly that there are some red and some blue blood vessels in this area. And again, let's just pick up on blood flow. And so oxygenated blood now in these small vessels in the lacunae. Oxygenated blood again makes its way via the merging of smaller vessels into larger vessels, makes its way into then the umbilical vein, which carries oxygenated blood to the developing embryo. And again, keep in mind, this is an unusual situation. The umbilical vein is a vein by definition because it's carrying blood to the heart, or towards the heart. And of course, the heart that we're talking about now is the embryonic heart. And it's unusual, again, in that it's carrying oxygenated blood. It's a vein carrying oxygenated blood. Let's take a look also now within the umbilical cord at the umbilical arteries and picture what's happened now in the area of the embryo, and so cut off and not shown in figure 2311. But in the area of the embryo then, the oxygen that's been taken to the embryo by the umbilical vein, that oxygen is now being used, and at the same time, carbon dioxide, a waste product, of course, of cellular respiration, is being carried away, or we want it to be carried away. And picture now that carbon dioxide diffusing into these very small veins, these very small arteries. Picture again carbon dioxide diffusing in the area of the embryo into these very small arteries. And now this blood being carried away, this deoxygenated blood being carried away from the embryo. And so we have then the merging of smaller into larger and larger and larger arteries, and finally coming through the umbilical cord in the area that's being labeled in figure 2311. Again, we have a pair of umbilical arteries carrying deoxygenated blood. And if you follow one of these blue vessels on down now and follow its branching all the way down into the lacuna and follow the branching all the way into the small blue vessels within the villi, and again then picture this carbon dioxide and these other waste products now moving from the villi into the mother's bloodstream, into these very small maternal venules, which again then will drain nutrient poor, oxygen poor, carbon dioxide, waste product rich blood, will drain this blood away from the area of the placenta and return it to the mother's system of blood vessels and back to the heart eventually to go through the various circuits that you guys are familiar with from A&P1. Finally, on figure 2311 then, notice that the placenta has been labeled for you, and keep in mind again then that the placenta has a maternal portion of the contribution, which is part of the mother's tissues, and this is part of the endometrium. And then recall also that the placenta has an embryonic portion, this being a portion of the chorion. And to finish up real quickly with this part of the chapter, let's take a look now on page 880 at figure 2312. Take a minute and notice we're seeing even more detail now in terms of blood vessels. So take a minute, find labeled for you the lacuna filled with maternal blood. Notice then the section of the villus that's been labeled. And so take a look now at that cross section of the villus. And keep in mind now that we're seeing in the enlarged portion of the section of the villus, we're seeing a bunch of blood cells, the small red structures, and of course the red blood cells around the margins of that section villus are maternal red blood cells, and the blood cells we're seeing within the small blood vessels in that cross section of the villus are blood vessels in the embryonic bloodstream. And keep in mind then, again, in order for, let's say, oxygen to make its way from red blood cells in the mother's bloodstream to blood cells in the embryo's bloodstream, the oxygen has a two-part barrier to cross, and the oxygen then must, first of all, diffuse through the wall of the villus, and it must also then diffuse through the wall of the embryonic capillaries. That concludes our discussion of the chorion and concludes our discussion of development of the placenta and how the placenta works. And we will finish up this chapter with review session 13.